But it made sense. I mean, if I was a Roman at the time, I probably would have thought 80k they had. I mean, that's a massive army. There's no way.
Grow up! You know what I mean? And so it was. With 2 new consuls, Rome put together a massive army. The biggest Rome had ever fielded to put Hannibal away once and for all. To gather the men required, 2/3 of them ended up being completely inexperienced. But how much experience does it take to be expendable war fodder? As this massive army set out in the summer of 216 BC, the Romans knew they needed to win this battle. Just one victory over Hannibal would likely be enough to end his entire campaign.
I'm so looking forward to the Battle of Cannae. I'm so looking forward to see how they represented it.
And this time, their overwhelming manpower gave them confidence they could do it. Hannibal had taken position at the town of Cannae, where he had captured an important Roman supply depot. With Fabius gone, Hannibal knew a battle was likely coming, and he was eager to fight it on his terms. But when his men looked out at the Roman camp, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. That army's huge! There's no way we can possibly beat off all these men. How are we gonna beat off all of these men? You know what I mean. I think he's right, Hannibal. Hannibal is then said to have replied, Gisco, my friend, don't worry. There may be a lot of them, but amongst their ranks, there's not a single man named Gisco. This joke was apparently so funny that his officers began to laugh and laugh. And when his men in the camp heard the laughter, they were like, hey, they're laughing. I guess that means we're gonna win the battle. Yippee! As for the Romans, the consuls were another pairing between an inexperienced hothead and a wise scholar. Although the main historian from this era was good friends with Paulus's family, so take that with a grain of salt.
Sure.
On his day
Nice context. Nice context. I mean, this is a cartoon channel. Rather than blue, I would have gone for black here.
command, the rash and hasty Varro, despite the apparent pleas from Paulus, sent the army out for battle. And when Hannibal saw this, he did the same.
Look at that.
And here comes the single largest battle of the Second Punic War, and one of the most renowned battles in history.
Very infamous.
The infamous Battle of Cannae. In all the pre-battle maneuvering, Hannibal was able to ensure his army was fighting from the south. This meant the seasonal dust-carrying winds were to his back and blowing directly into the faces of the Romans. Like I said, control. After 2 years in Italy, Hannibal's infantry had dwindled to about 40,000. The Romans possibly outnumbered him 2 to 1. Their army was so big that their maniples stretched far deeper than they normally would. The Romans planned to charge Hannibal's thin, weak line.
Fantastic animations.
Like a battering ram and break it. They also chose a narrow battlefield in the hopes it would prevent Hannibal's far superior cavalry from being able to outmaneuver them. They wanted an honorable battle where pure strength rather than trickery would decide the outcome. If Hannibal had his say, however, trickery might end up having a lot to do with it.
Yeah, you can see the Celtic contingents here. I would have given them the Carthaginians as well. Kind of very similar oblong center-gripped shields. They should have those too.
He ordered his line to position themselves as an outward bulge, with his weakest troops at the very center. Just behind them, out of sight from the Romans, stood the elite Libyan infantry, waiting for their moment to strike. The battle commenced as the massive Roman troops smashed into the Carthaginian center. The shape of Hannibal's line ensured the overwhelming weight of the Romans hit his weakest troops first, and they were pushed back. Hannibal's outward bulge reversed inward, with the Romans being funneled in towards the weak center. Hannibal had positioned himself at the center to encourage the troops to hold out as long as possible against the Roman onslaught, because while the Romans were unleashing carnage on the center, Hannibal's cavalry needed time to do their job. The heavy cavalry on the left, after a barbaric fight, sent the Roman horse packing, with the consul Paulus even sustaining a severe head injury. He managed to move into the center to keep the battle going. Then, the heavy cavalry turned and approached Varro's cavalry from behind. At the first sight of the coming Carthaginian envelopment, Varro ordered his horsemen to flee the battlefield. The Carthaginians had won the cavalry battle. But back in the center, according to some accounts, Hannibal's line did eventually end up caving to the massive weight of the Romans, and they began to flee. The Romans pushed deeper, and organization within the army likely broke down as they became a giant mass trying to massacre the fleeing Carthaginians. They didn't realize.
And that's because it's not like now we're looking at this and be like, oh, but that's stupid, they're getting an envelope. But normally that's when you gain most of your kills during a battle, is when they rout. So as they start running away, they turn their backs, that's when you pursue and butcher them. So what they're doing here usually works, probably for a problem of miscommunication because of what that consul did running away. They didn't know that that had happened, and so that the cavalry would have arrived.
That they were playing right into Hannibal's hands.
Yeah.
At that moment, Hannibal's elite units, having done no fighting yet, and therefore fresh as a daisy, turned and smashed into the Roman sides. Many of these troops were wearing Roman helmets and armor they had picked up after previous battles, and the confused Romans may not have even realized they were the enemy, as Hannibal managed to regain the composure of his center and encourage them back.
Also because they were very similarly equipped. That's an important section that I did mention at the very beginning, sort of. But they were very similarly equipped. Really, you just need to put the freaking plumes up.
Into the fight, the Carthaginian cavalry swooped in from behind. And look at what lies before you. A military general's wet dream. The total encirclement of a much larger force by a much smaller force. The Romans were trapped. Hannibal had unbelievably managed to use their own superiority in numbers against them. Rather than simply encircling them, he had actually allowed them to use their own immense power and push themselves into an encircled position. This was the genius of Cannae.
Yep.
And with that, the annihilation began. For hours, the Carthaginians slaughtered the helpless Romans from all sides. The terrified Romans were so tightly packed that at times they couldn't even lift their arms to defend themselves. The killing went on so long that the Carthaginians became exhausted from the non-stop massacre. And by the time the butchery came to an end, the grim toll spoke for itself. To Hannibal's several thousand lost, the Romans suffered
50K.
60 to 80,000 dead or
But yeah, they got butchered like that. And at first I actually struggled to believe it, but then we reviewed the data, and it's in this case is probably not an exaggeration.
captured. Yet another entire army wiped out by Hannibal. Many high-ranking Romans met their end at Cannae. Paulus, for one, but also 80 senators and more. It's been estimated that 20% of Rome's male population, aged 18 to 50, died at Cannae. This was it. Hannibal's vengeance. The stunned Carthaginians, as they searched for their own survivors among the dead, couldn't believe the sight of it. An estimated 30,000 gallons of blood now lay spilled on the battlefield. Rome's defeat at Cannae sent shockwaves throughout Italy.
Absolutely.
Just as Hannibal had hoped, most of southern Italy now defected to his side, including the second largest city on the peninsula. Wow.
Yep.
Hannibal, this is incredible. What could possibly come next? Next? Jim Bob. I've killed 150,000 Romans. I've turned her allies against her. That's it. That's vengeance. So let me tell you what comes next. Rome surrenders.
And they
Their
don't.
territories are reduced. We recover our lost islands. And Carthage dominates the Mediterranean once again.
I mean, it could have happened. I think the moment when Hannibal loses the war before Zama, because Zama is like the final event that marks the end, of course, but the causal link was the loss of Spain. That's why I was looking forward. It's probably the next video, which I believe they just published, so we're totally watching that together. But it's when he loses Spain I think that's the moment when he loses the war.
But sir, what if they don't surrender? Jim Bob, did you miss what just happened? Of course they're gonna surrender.
Not the Romans.
Throughout his campaign, Hannibal had shown himself to be very adept at reading the Roman mind. But if he now thought that Rome might surrender, it was the first time he severely underestimated them.
Yep.
And he was about to discover an extremely inconvenient fact about Rome. Rome never surrenders.
Absolutely.
At a Roman survivors' camp near Cannae, one young officer overheard some troops discussing how they would flee Rome. Drawing his sword, he threatened to cut down any man that would
You know who
abandon
that
Rome
is?
in its hour of need. That officer was
It's
Scipio
him.
the Younger. But soon enough, the Romans would come to call him Scipio
Africanus.
Africanus,
Yeah.
the hero of Rome.